All right, welcome back to our lecture here on the geography and culture of ancient China. In part one, we talked about the geography. In part two, we're going to focus on the culture that develops because of that geography and look at some of the unique pieces of the Chinese. So we're going to talk about some early dynasties. Remember, as I introduce this to you, I'm going to mention the Xia dynasty, the Shang dynasty, and the Zhou dynasty. And those are dynasties that are important, but we're not going to focus on them heavily, but they are the beginning of the story, so I at least have to mention them. They will not be on your test for my students. The development of Chinese culture. Fossils show that modern humans lived in southwest China 1.7 million years ago. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean they met the 5 characteristics of a civilization, but it tells us there have been people in China for a very long time. What the records and stories of China tell us is that the first Chinese dynasty, the Xia dynasty, started around 2000 BC. If you add that to AD, that's over 4,000 years ago. When I say legend, that means those are oral stories that have been passed down for years and years and years. So the Chinese culture has been around for a very long time. What's interesting about the Chinese is because they were locked into their area due to geography, they really kind of viewed outsiders as not as good. And that's a regular occurrence in many different cultures across the world. So the Chinese viewed everyone outside of their culture as barbarians. In fact, they viewed themselves as the center of the civilized world. And that's an interesting thing because the Chinese were incredibly advanced. Other cultures will look down upon the Chinese, as, that's what cultures do. They think they're the best, and they think others are less than them. Racism's been around for a very long time. But the perceived idea of the Chinese is that they were backwards, but the Chinese were incredibly civilized. They had palaces and great stuff. They're going to invent all sorts of good things like gunpowder and paper, and the list is going to go on and on and on. So they really were civilized in a lot of unique ways. Their name for themselves, the Chinese name for China, was the Middle Kingdom. Now, don't get that confused with the time periods of ancient Egypt, with the Old Kingdom, Middle Kingdom, and New Kingdom. This is a name of a place rather than a name of a time period. Again, they thought of themselves as the center of the civilized world. It's like the solar system. They're the sun. Everybody revolves around them, is sort of the way they looked at things. Family has always been very central to Chinese society. Respect for one's parents. You don't bring shame. You don't bring dishonor upon the household. Very, very center to Chinese culture. And you could say a lot of other cultures on the planet believe in something similar. Certainly, I hope you don't dishonor your parents or mistreat them. But Chinese, very, very important to them that family is respected. Traditionally, in Chinese culture, women have been treated as inferior or inferiors. Women have not had the same rights. Some women have not had the same opportunities as men. It's a very patriarchal society where men dominate things, and there's a lot of truth to that still here today in the modern world. So girls were arranged to be married between ages 13 and 16. A woman would rarely ever choose her spouse based on love that was chosen for her. Certainly not a very conducive religion to women's rights. So religion in China. China has traditionally resisted the big religions. If you look at this graph, you're not going to see a high percentage of Christians, Muslims, Jews, or even Hindus in China. Those are the biggest religions on the planet. They have a little bit of Buddhism, because Buddhism started in India and then moved east into China. But if you look at it, over 52% is unaffiliated, meaning unreligious. There's some that have about 21% that are Chinese folk religions, but the big religions make up a very small part of China. And again, we're talking about the most populous country on the planet. And so more of what we've seen in the past, the religion is spirit of ancestors, was revered. You worship your ancestors, or you call upon your ancestors and their spirits. And they had the power to bring good fortune, but they were not seen as gods. They are not divine or anything like that, as having powers like other religions have seen. So China has really a unique look at religion compared to the Western world. Now, language in China can be difficult, so there's no links between the spoken and written language in China. To make that make sense, basically one could read Chinese without being able to speak the language. So all parts of China learn the same system of writing. So you could travel around China, and you might not be able to have a conversation with the people you come in contact with. But because you all wrote the same language, you could write to each other. So that does have a benefit with trade and things like that. Yeah, I might not be able to talk to you, but maybe we can write. And maybe we can communicate that way. So they wrote the same even if they spoke different languages. And that had a unifying effect on different parts of China, at least if you have the same writing. Imagine us going down to Texas and trying to talk to people from Texas. And I'm not making fun of you people from Texas. I love Texas. I've been there. But maybe if we don't understand your southern drawl the same way, or maybe you don't understand our Minnesotan accents, but we could all, if we can, write things down in English together, then we can still communicate. So something to think about. In order to be just a basic level of literate in Chinese or Mandarin Chinese, you need to know 1,500 characters just to be considered literate. Think about it. In English, we need to know 26 characters plus our number system, so add 10 to that. Or in China, you need to know 1,500. To be a scholar, to be educated, you need to know 10,000 characters. So learning the Chinese language is quite difficult. So here's some examples of some Chinese characters. Here's some examples over here about the Sinitic languages, different Chinese languages. Mandarin is the one that dominates China, but you can see there's some different dialects and different versions of the Chinese language. So you can take a look at that and see the different numbers that are associated with that on your own. Now, I told you we're going to talk about some of these dynasties. So we're going to mention the Zhou dynasty here. Zhou was pretty small, but here again it's located right in that same area that we've been talking about on the North China Plain. So a couple of things that are very important to the Chinese were the Dynastic Cycle and the Mandate of Heaven. So in 1027 BC, a people called the Zhou became the ruling dynasty of China. The Zhou believed in the Mandate of Heaven, or divine approval to rule. Basically, if you were going to be the leader of China, you had to have the Mandate of Heaven. The Mandate of Heaven was essentially the spirits, ancestors, giving you as the emperor their thumbs up. Like, you can rule, you can be our leader. And the Mandate of Heaven became central to the Chinese view of government. But people didn't rule forever. Dynasties didn't rule forever. So we got to talk about something called the Dynastic Cycle. So this helped explain the Dynastic Cycle, and the definition of that is a pattern of rise, decline, and replacement of dynasties if the spirits did not approve of one king's rule. So let me extrapolate this a little bit further with a couple of images. Oh, that one didn't quite work. So let's look at this one. So a new dynasty would take over. A dynasty is a ruling family, whereas, being a patriarchal society is where a father would rule, and his son would rule, and his son would rule, and so on and so forth. So a new dynasty would take over, and they would start making some changes, maybe make the empire run smoother, and eventually everything works for a little while. But then maybe the government becomes corrupt. Or maybe some bad things start happening, like famine, natural disaster, things like that. The commoners start becoming tired of the problems, so maybe they grab the pitchforks and they revolt. Now the dynasty has been considered to have lost the Mandate of Heaven. Like, bad things are happening in China. And so the ancestors would be saying, whoa, 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 the leaders in this dynasty aren't doing a very good job. It's time to get rid of them. That's how the Chinese would have interpreted this. So then it's time to get rid of the emperor or that dynasty. Sometimes they're defeated, sometimes they're assassinated, and then you replace it with a new dynasty. So China's had a lot of different dynasties. That's what I would have shown you with that image on the previous slide, so I apologize for that not working, but we can move forward without that. And still get the idea here is that the Mandate of Heaven drove whether the dynasty was going to be successful or not. Continuing on, so the use of royal families controlling different regions was known as feudalism. So eventually, as power broke down, you had small ruling families across China. That's really what feudalism is small ruling families. We are going to act that out. We're going to see that a lot more in depth when we get to our part of Japan in this unit. Now, towards the end of the Zhao era, we know a couple of things about them. We know they were generally peaceful. We know they innovated some good things. So the Zhao dynasty, also pronounced the Zhou dynasty, so I'll go back and forth on that one. The Zhou dynasty innovated roads and canals. They coined money. They made blast furnaces. So there was some definite improvements under the Zhou. But what ends up happening towards the end is they start to lose power. They start losing the mandate of heaven. And that leads to something called the Warring States period. So the Zhou dynasty lost power during the Warring States period and would later lead to China's unification under Shi Huangdi in the Qin dynasty. So the Warring States period is exactly what it sounds like. Different factions, different families of China warring over who is going to control China. Well, the first of the big dynasties that we are going to study in this unit, and that's the next learning outcome in this unit, is the Qin dynasty. We saw them in engineering and empire. We saw Shi Huangdi. He was not a good person, but he is remembered as being the first emperor, and there are some positives that come with his rule that we're going to look at over the next couple of days. So again, we're not going to look at the Zhou dynasty in particular. I mentioned them here because they're the beginning of the story, but it leads us to our first big dynasty under Shi Huangdi and the Qin dynasty. So I'm setting the stage for that to come. We're going to look at that further over the next couple of days. So here's just a map showing the Warring States period. You have all these different groups fighting each other, and it's going to be the Qin that's going to take over and unify China under Shi Huangdi. So Warring States is exactly what it sounds like, different people fighting for power in China. So this brings us to the end, our result. China's culture has been shaped by the geography surrounding its people. A highly evolved culture that began with the Xia, Shang, and Zhou dynasties will become one of the world's oldest. I mean, like I told you, they're still there. They've been around for over 4,000 years. This unique people will be regularly disrupted by the rise and fall of governments that will later be known as the Dynastic Cycle. Our studies in this unit will focus on 5 of those dynasties. We're going to start with the Qin. We're going to look at the Han, the Tang, the Sung, and the Yuan. The Yuan dynasty is actually a Mongol dynasty ruled by Kublai Khan and the Mongols. So we're going to move forward and look at those dynasties and understand them a little bit deeper. So here you have it, the geography and culture of China. Come back to our constructive response question. It says, describe China's geography and give examples as to how the Chinese adapted to it. We looked at their geography in part 1. We talked about different adaptations, like living on the North China Plain, certainly becoming self-dependent. Even the video on Engineering and Empire talking about the Great Wall. They built the Great Wall as an adaptation. So there's many different adaptations the Chinese have had due to their geography. So that's going to do it for us here. Hope you learned something. We'll see you next time.